On my 60th birthday, my 5-year-old grandchild pointed at my son's face and asked, "Why does Daddy cry when he sees Grandma's picture?" The room went silent. My son stood frozen. I asked, "What do you mean, sweetheart?" The child replied, "He says he lied about the accident." My son snapped, "She was going to leave us." I had no choice. Everyone gasped. My hands shook as I whispered, "You caused that crash, didn't you?" And then he said 5 words that broke me. She never made it out. I never thought I'd make it this far. Not because I lived a particularly dangerous life, but because, for the longest time, I didn't see much point in living past 55. That was the year I lost Isabel. The year my world turned gray. But time moves on whether you want it to or not, and before I knew it, I was sitting in my own living room, surrounded by family, watching my grandchildren run around, trying to convince myself that the laughter and love in the air could make up for what was missing. "Happy birthday, Dad." My daughter-in-law, Monica, leaned over and kissed my cheek, setting a plate of cake in front of me. 60 looks good on you." 60 looks tired, I joked, tapping my fork against the plate. "Well, you've earned it," she said warmly before turning to grab another plate for my son, Brandon. Brandon sat across from me, nursing a whiskey. He wasn't much of a drinker, not usually, but I'd noticed over the past year that he'd started reaching for alcohol more often at family gatherings. Something about him had changed, though I could never put my finger on exactly what it was. He was still the same Brandon I'd raised, the same kid who used to cry over scraped knees and beg me to let him stay up late to watch movies. The same boy who used to make Isabel laugh until she had tears in her eyes. But there was a distance now, a quietness. And I never had the courage to ask why. "Grandpa." The small voice pulled me from my thoughts. I turned to see my 5-year-old grandson, Leo, standing near the fireplace, his tiny finger pointing at the framed picture of Isabel on the mantel. He was a sweet kid, always full of curiosity, always asking questions. But it was the way he asked this one that sent a chill through me. "Why does Daddy cry when he sees Grandma's picture?" The room went silent. I saw Monica stiffen in the kitchen. My brother, Hank, who had been chatting with my niece, suddenly looked over, his beer halfway to his lips. Even the kids, who had been chasing each other around the coffee table just moments before, seemed to sense that something was wrong. Brandon froze. His fingers tightened around his glass. I cleared my throat, trying to ease the tension. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Leo looked between me and his father, completely unaware of the sudden weight in the air. "Daddy says he lied about the accident." I felt the blood drain from my face. Brandon shot up from his seat, his face pale. "Leo, that's enough." His voice was sharp, urgent. Leo flinched at his father's tone, but kept going, as children do when they don't understand the danger of their words. "But you did, Daddy. You said, Leo." Brandon barked. The little boy's mouth snapped shut, and he shrank back, clearly confused. My hands were shaking as I set my fork down on the plate. I could feel every eye in the room on me, but all I could see was Brandon. My son. My only son. "Brandon," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is he talking about?" Brandon's jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. His eyes darted around the room, looking for a way out, a way to make this go away. Finally, he let out a breath. "She was going to leave us." His voice was thick with something: anger, desperation, maybe both. A murmur rippled through the room. My chest tightened. "Leave?" He exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "She was going to leave me. She was going to take you with her." I couldn't breathe. My throat felt like it was closing. "Brandon." My voice cracked. "What are you saying?" His eyes were wild now, darting between me and the floor. His hands clenched into fists. "I had no choice," he choked out. My stomach turned. I felt my whole body grow cold. "You caused that crash, didn't you?" Brandon's breath hitched. His fingers twitched. He opened his mouth, closed it again. And then he said 5 words that shattered everything I knew about my life. She never made it out. It was like the world tilted on its axis. The walls of my home, the home Isabel and I built together, felt like they were closing in on me. I heard someone gasp, maybe Monica, maybe my niece. I wasn't sure. The room blurred. My ears rang. "Say it again," I whispered, even though I had heard him perfectly the first time. Brandon swallowed hard. His face was ashen. I tried to stop her. I followed her that night. She was going to leave, Dad. She was done. She was taking Leo. She was taking everything. I couldn't let her do that to us. My hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the edge of the table just to steady myself. "You told me the brakes failed," I said, my voice barely holding together. Brandon squeezed his eyes shut. I cut the line. A strangled noise escaped me. My body betrayed me. I stood too fast, the room spinning as I swayed on my feet. "Ukulele her?" My voice cracked with something animalistic, something raw and broken. Brandon flinched, but he didn't deny it. The weight of it crashed down on me all at once. My knees nearly buckled. "You let me—" I couldn't even get the words out. "You let me grieve for years, thinking it was an accident." Brandon's face twisted. "I didn't think it would happen like that." His voice was desperate now. "I just wanted to scare her. I just wanted her to change her mind." I took a shaky step forward. But she never made it out. Brandon's lips parted slightly. His breath shuddered. And in that moment, I knew. The fire. I remembered the smell of burnt fabric, the blackened remains of the car. The way they told me Isabel had been trapped, that the flames had engulfed the front seat before she could escape. "She was alive," I whispered. Brandon squeezed his eyes shut, a single tear slipping down his cheek. And suddenly, my own son, the boy I had raised, the boy I had loved more than life itself, was a stranger. My hands curled into fists. My whole body trembled. "Get out," I breathed. "Dad, get out." I roared. Brandon jolted like I had struck him. Monica was crying now, clutching Leo to her chest, shielding him from the horror of what had just unfolded. Brandon hesitated, like he wanted to say something, like he wanted to take it all back. But there was no taking this back. He turned and walked out the door. And just like that, I lost my son, too. The door slammed shut behind him, but the silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps, staring at the empty space where my son had just been. My knees felt weak, my hands trembled, and my head pounded like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my skull. I could feel everyone's eyes on me, my family, my friends, the people who had gathered to celebrate my birthday, now frozen in place like they had stumbled into some twisted nightmare. No one spoke. No one moved. Then, Monica let out a shaky sob. "Oh my God," she whispered, her arms tightening around Leo as if she could shield him from the words that had just poisoned the air. I forced myself to look at her, at my grandson, whose big, confused eyes darted between us. He didn't understand what had just happened. He didn't know that his innocent question had just cracked open a truth that had been buried for years. The truth that my own son, my flesh and blood, had emridered his mother. My stomach twisted, bile rising in my throat. I turned away, gripping the back of the couch, my fingernails digging into the fabric. My vision blurred, my breath hitched. "I thought I was going to be sick." Hank's voice broke through the chaos first. "Jesus Christ, what the HLL did we just hear?" No one answered. No one could. My niece, Sarah, finally moved. She slowly set down her wine glass with a trembling hand, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile reality we were clinging to. This can't be real," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. He was lying, right? He had to be lying. I wanted to believe that. God, I wanted to. But I had seen the truth in Brandon's face. The way his eyes darted away. The way his body tensed like a man waiting for a verdict. He wasn't lying. And the weight of it pressed down on my chest like a boulder. Monica turned to me, her face pale. "What do we do?" I couldn't answer her. My thoughts were too scrambled, my mind spinning in too many directions at once. I felt like I was standing in the middle of a storm, waves crashing over me, dragging me under. But one thought pushed through the chaos. One sickening, horrifying realization. Brandon had lived with this secret for years. Which meant that every hug, every shared meal, every moment we had spent together since Isabel's death had been a lie. I had mourned with him. I had held him while he cried. I had believed, wholeheartedly, that he was just as broken as I was. And the entire time, he had been the reason for my grief. I couldn't breathe. Monica shifted, pulling me back to reality. "I can't stay here," she whispered, her voice thick with panic. "I can't, Leo," she shook her head, her arms tightening around my grandson. She was afraid. Of him. Of her own husband. And the worst part? I didn't blame her. I turned to her, my voice hoarse. "Take Leo upstairs." She hesitated for only a second before nodding. She hurried toward the stairs, shielding Leo's ears, whispering something soft and soothing to him as they disappeared down the hall. I forced myself to stand up straight. "What are you going to do?" Hank asked. I swallowed hard, the taste of bile still in my throat. "I don't know." The words felt hollow. Because the truth was, there were only two real options. Turn him in. Or cover for him. And no matter which one I chose, I was going to lose my son forever. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thick and suffocating. I rubbed a hand over my face, but it did nothing to ground me. My son had just confessed to M. Ryder, and now my family was looking at me, waiting for me to do something. My hands clenched and unclenched as I tried to process the impossible. Jesus Christ, Hank muttered again, pacing near the dining table. What the HLL do we do now? Monica had taken Leo upstairs. I could still hear the faint sound of her whispering to him, trying to distract him from the chaos he had unknowingly unleashed. I looked toward the door. My son had just walked out of it, but he hadn't left my life yet. Not really. The weight of his confession still hung heavy in the room, pressing down on my chest. I had spent the last 5 years mourning Isabel, believing she had died in a tragic accident. I had grieved with Brandon, held him as he sobbed, thinking we were two men broken by the same loss. But all this time, he knew. He knew. And now I had to decide what to do with that knowledge. Hank stopped pacing and looked at me, his eyes dark and unreadable. Are we calling the cops, or what? His words slammed into me like a brick. I felt a strange ringing in my ears, like I was standing too close to an explosion. The cops. Turning in my own son. The thought made my stomach churn. You heard what he said, right? Hank continued. He cut the damn brake line. He let you think it was an accident. He let all of us think it was an accident. My niece, Sarah, spoke up, her voice hesitant. But, did he mean for her to die? Hank let out a bitter laugh. Does it matter? She did die. I barely heard them. My mind was racing, stuck in an endless loop of images and memories. Isabel's car. The fire. The way they told me she never made it out. And now, the truth. I forced myself to speak, my voice hoarse. I need to talk to him. Hank's head snapped toward me. Are you out of your goddamn mind? Sarah let out a small, shaky breath. Maybe Uncle Walter is right. I barely registered her using my name. It was the first time anyone had spoken it since this nightmare began. He just confessed to M. Ryder, Sarah. Hank snapped. What the HLL is there to talk about? I swallowed hard. I need to hear it again. I need to know why. Hank shook his head in disbelief. Why? So you can find some way to justify it? He K-led his own mother, Walt. What are you even? He's still my son. I snapped. The words echoed through the room, silencing everyone. For a long moment, no one spoke. Hank let out a slow breath, rubbing a hand over his mouth. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah, he's your son. There was no mistaking the judgment in his voice. But I didn't care. I turned toward the door. My legs felt heavy, but I forced myself to move. Every step felt like I was dragging chains behind me. Walt, Hank called after me. You don't have to do this. But I did. I had to know why. I stepped outside. Brandon was sitting on the front steps, his head in his hands. The night air was cold, but he didn't seem to notice. A half-empty bottle of whiskey sat beside him, the amber liquid catching the glow of the porch light. I stood there for a moment, staring at him, trying to reconcile the man in front of me with the little boy I had raised. He must have heard me step forward because he lifted his head. His eyes were red-rimmed, but there was no fight left in them. No excuses, just guilt. Did you mean for her to die? I asked. Brandon let out a shuddering breath. No. I waited. He swallowed hard, staring down at his hands. I just wanted to scare her. I wanted her to think twice before leaving. I thought if she lost control of the car, she'd panic and come home. I didn't think. He exhaled sharply, shaking his head. I didn't think the fire would spread that fast. I closed my eyes. You cut the brakes, Brandon. What did you think would happen? His voice cracked. I don't know. I was desperate, Dad. She was going to take Leo. She was going to take everything. His breathing was ragged now. I couldn't let her do that. I just wanted to make her stop. I clenched my fists, fighting the urge to shake him, to make him understand the sheer insanity of what he had done. You let me think she died in an accident, I said, my voice shaking. For 5 years. You let me grieve, you let me, I know, Brandon whispered. I know. I felt my breath hitch. My son, my only son, was a M. Ryder, and now I had to decide what to do about it. The wind had picked up. It whistled through the trees, rustling the dead leaves on the pavement. I stared at Brandon, trying to find something, anything, in his face that would make this easier. Some hint of the little boy I had raised, the boy who used to cry when he skinned his knee, who would sneak into our bed during thunderstorms, clutching Isabel's hand like she was his whole world. But all I saw was a man I didn't recognize. A man who had carried a terrible secret for years and had only let it slip because of a 5-year-old's innocent question. Brandon sniffed and ran a hand down his face. What are you gonna do? His voice was hollow, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Hope? Fear? He wanted to know if I was going to turn him in. And for the first time in my life, I didn't know if I could protect my son. I swallowed hard. My hands trembled at my sides, my stomach twisted into knots, and I felt something ugly clawing at my chest. What am I gonna do? I repeated, my voice low and raw. That's what you're asking me right now? Brandon flinched. You let me think it was an accident, I continued, my voice shaking. You let me sit in that goddamn hospital morgue and identify her burned body. You let me hold your son, trying to explain to him that his mother wasn't coming home. And now you want to know what I'm gonna do? Brandon's shoulders hunched. He looked small, weak, but I didn't feel sorry for him. I felt sick. He exhaled sharply, gripping his hair. I was gonna tell you. Bullshit, I spat. His head snapped up, eyes wide. He hadn't expected that. I took a step forward, my body thrumming with barely contained rage. You were never gonna tell me, Brandon. If Leo hadn't said something, you would have kept this secret for the rest of your goddamn life. He looked away, his throat bobbing. You let me love you, I whispered. You let me love you like I didn't already lose everything. Brandon squeezed his eyes shut. I didn't mean for it to happen like that, Dad. I wanted to scare her. I wanted her to come back home. I didn't know. You cut the brakes. I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty street. What the HLL did you think was going to happen? Brandon flinched like I had struck him. His chest heaved. I thought she'd have time. He let out a choked sob. I didn't know the fire would spread like that. I didn't know she wouldn't. I turned away, my hands on my knees, trying to catch my breath. My pulse was hammering in my ears. The fire. The thought of it made me nauseous. The way they said she had been trapped, how the flames had engulfed the car before she could escape. I gritted my teeth, my hands curling into fists. I wanted to hit something. I wanted to hurt him. I wanted to KLL him. The realization was so sudden, so violent, that I had to straighten up and take a step back. I clenched my jaw, trying to force the dark thoughts away. Brandon was crying now. His body shook as he buried his face in his hands. And for a moment, I felt nothing. No sympathy, no sadness. Just cold, burning rage. I took a slow breath and forced my voice to stay level. Monica is taking Leo and leaving. Brandon's head snapped up. What? You heard me. My voice was steel. She's taking Leo, and you're not gonna stop her. His face crumpled. Dad, don't, I warned, my voice deadly quiet. Don't you dare try to tell me you deserve to keep him. Brandon looked like he was going to argue, but I saw the moment my words sank in. His face twisted in agony, and he let out a shaky breath, nodding. She won't forgive me, he whispered. I didn't respond. Because I wouldn't forgive him either. I turned toward the house, my limbs heavy. I had nothing left to say to him. Not now. Maybe not ever. Brandon sat there on the steps, watching me walk away. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I still loved my son. I stepped back inside, shutting the door behind me. The house felt different, like something had shifted, like the warmth that had once filled it had been drained away, leaving nothing but a hollow space. Monica was sitting on the couch, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, staring blankly at the floor. She looked up when she heard me, her eyes red-rimmed. He's still out there, she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded. She swallowed. What are we going to do? We. Not I. She was waiting for me to decide. For me to determine what happened next. For the past 5 years, I had lived in a lie of someone else's making. I had let grief consume me, let the pain of losing Isabel become my whole existence. And now I knew that all of it, was because of the man I had raised. And the worst part? He wasn't a monster. He wasn't some cold-blooded killer. He was a desperate, selfish man who made a choice that destroyed lives. I ran a hand down my face. You're leaving him. Monica flinched. Maybe a part of her had hoped I'd tell her it was okay to stay. That somehow, she could love him enough to erase what he had done. But I wasn't going to give her that lie. She nodded slowly, her breath shaky. He'll fight me for Leo. No, I said. He won't. Because I wouldn't let him. I turned toward my brother, who was standing by the fireplace, arms crossed. Hank, I need a favor. He narrowed his eyes. What kind of favor? I glanced back at Monica. You and Leo are going to pack your things. You're getting out of here tonight. Her lips parted slightly. Tonight? Yes. But where will I go? You'll stay with Hank for now, I said without hesitation. At least until we figure out something more permanent. Hank let out a low whistle. You're serious about this? I leveled him with a hard look. Damn right I am. Sarah, who had been silent this entire time, finally spoke up. Brandon's not going to just let her leave. He's going to come after her. I looked at Monica. That's why you need to go now. Before he has time to think. Her breath hitched, but she nodded. Okay. I turned back to Hank. And you know people. I need you to make sure she has everything on Brandon. Bank records, text messages, anything that proves he's unfit to have Leo. Hank frowned. That's a little extreme, don't you think? No, I said. It's not. Because here's the thing about revenge, it doesn't always have to be loud or violent. Sometimes, the best revenge is taking away the one thing someone truly cares about. And for Brandon, that was Leo. Monica packed quickly. She was still shaking as she stuffed clothes into a suitcase, her movements jerky and frantic. I helped where I could, but mostly, I just made sure she didn't waste time second-guessing herself. By the time she came back down the stairs, Leo was already half asleep in her arms. She hesitated at the door. What if he comes looking for us? I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. He won't find you. Because I would make sure of that. As soon as Hank and Monica left, I grabbed my coat. Sarah frowned. Where are you going? I didn't answer. I just walked back outside. Brandon was still sitting on the steps, staring at the pavement like it held the answers to all of his problems. He barely reacted when I stood in front of him. Monica's gone, I said. His head snapped up. What? She took Leo. His entire body tensed. No. She wouldn't just, she did, I interrupted. And you're not going after them. Brandon shot to his feet. Like HLL I'm not. I grabbed his collar and yanked him forward, our faces inches apart. You listen to me, and you listen good. You don't deserve that boy. You don't deserve to be his father. Brandon's face twisted. He's my son. No, I said, my voice sharp as a KNFA. He's Isabel's son. And I'll be damned if I let you ruin him like you ruined her. He tried to push me away, but I held firm. From this moment on, you're done, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You're going to sign over full custody to Monica. No lawyers. No fight. Nothing. Because if you even think about trying to take Leo from her, I will dedicate every second of my life to destroying you. Brandon swallowed hard. You can't do that. I smirked. Can't I? I let go of his collar and took a step back. You forget, son. I raised you. I know every weakness you have. I know every mistake you've ever made. And, trust me, I will find something to bury you with. Brandon looked away, his jaw tightening. I could see the war in his head. He wanted to fight. He wanted to win. But he also knew me. And he knew I wasn't bluffing. His shoulders slumped. Dad. Don't, I said. Don't call me that. He flinched. I turned away from him, stepping back toward the house. I'll send you the paperwork. Sign it, and this ends here. Try to fight it, and I promise you, you'll lose more than just your son. I walked back inside and shut the door behind me. For the first time in 5 years, I felt like I could breathe. Because Isabel's story wasn't going to end with him winning. Leo would grow up safe. He would grow up free from the weight of his father's sins. And that was the best revenge I could ever give her.